Good morning, everybody. On behalf of the 495 MetroWest Partnership, I want to thank you for joining us for this morning's meeting of our Transportation Committee. My name is Jason Palich. I have the honor of serving as Executive Director of the partnership. We're honored to be joined this morning by Congressman Jake Auchincloss of Massachusetts' 4th District in this morning's session. In just a moment, I'll be turning things over to our Transportation Committee co-chairs, but first I'm going to go over some housekeeping items briefly. Today's session is in webinar format, so all attendees are muted. Following the presentation, we'll invite you to ask questions, either by typing comments and questions into the Q&A or the chat, or by raising your hand. Our committee co-chairs will moderate the Q&A and comment portion of the meeting. Please note, of course, that any comments or questions which are disrespectful or overly lengthy will not be asked. Having said that, we encourage you not to be shy this morning. Part of the reason the Congressman is with us is he's looking for feedback, so we certainly encourage everybody to speak up as you wish to do so. At a pre-pandemic Transportation Committee meeting, we'd begin with our participants and attendees going around the room to introduce themselves. In keeping with that spirit, though we can, of course, be gathering in person, at this time we invite you to utilize the chat function to introduce yourself with your name, title, and organization so folks can get a sense of who is with us this morning. Should you experience any technical problems during the session, our immediate guidance is to log out and then log back in. Should you need further assistance, the partnership's Manager of Policy and Planning, Jeremy Thompson, is available to assist you and can be reached via email at jeremy@495partnership.org. One last technical note, this morning's session is being recorded and will be posted online likely later today. Before I turn things over to our co-chairs, I do want to acknowledge a special guest we have with us in the audience this morning, a member of the region's legislative delegation. Our welcome, as always, to State Representative Carolyn Dykema of Holliston. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to our Transportation Committee co-chairs, Rob Nagy of VHB and Joe Nolan of City Point Partners. Take it away, Rob.
Great, thank you, Jason. Again, I'm Rob Nagy. I'm a principal and transportation engineer at VHB, and I'm joined here today by Joe Nolan from the town of Wayland and City Point Partners. Thanks, Joe, for joining me today. We're pleased today to honor the newest member of the 495 MetroWest Congressional delegation, making his first appearance before the partnership in any form. Serving in his first term, Congressman Auchincloss has been assigned to the House Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure, where he serves on the Highways and Transit, Coast Guard, and Maritime Transportation, as well as Roads, Pipelines, and Hazardous Materials Subcommittees. It's a lot of work there. Congressman Auchincloss was born and raised in Newton, Massachusetts. He's the son of a surgeon and a scientist. And after graduating from Harvard College, he joined the Marines, commanded infantry in Afghanistan and special ops in Panama. He's now a major in the reserves, so thank you for your service. When Congressman Auchincloss returned home to Newton, he won election to the Newton City Council in 2015, where he chaired the Transportation and Public Safety Committees and was a member of the Land Use Committee in Newton. While serving as a city councilor on nights and weekends, he managed teams at both a Fortune 100 and a startup company. He's led product development in cybersecurity and insurance. He has degrees in economics and finance from Harvard College and MIT Sloan. He's been outspoken about the need to get funding directly into the pockets of local governments, small businesses, and individuals as we combat COVID-19. And he's been a leading voice in the need to return safely children to schools as we scale up vaccination and mass testing. The congressman lives in Newtonville with his wife, Michelle, their son, Teddy, and their Labrador Retriever, Donut, which makes me hungry. In his free time, he still loves to read American history, so thank you. Congressman Auchincloss represents all or portions of 34 communities in Massachusetts, including within the 495 MetroWest Partnership Committee boundaries, the communities of Bellingham, Foxborough, Franklin, Hopedale, Hopkinton, Medfield, Medway, Milford, Millis, Norfolk, Plainville, and Wrentham. So it's a great introduction. Thank you for joining us, Congressman. Please take it away. All yours.
Rob, I appreciate the introduction, and Jason and the 495 MetroWest Partnership, thank you for hosting me this morning. I also want to extend a welcome to Representative Dykema. Carolyn and I have become friends over the last year, I'm happy to say, and certainly I'm working closely with her on many of the things I'm about to discuss. And I'm looking at the chat window here and I'm seeing that I'm very happy to see that I have friends in the audience. James Fries, who was formerly in Newton until Natick took him away and is one of the finest planners, I think, in the state. Paul Yorkis, with whom I've worked closely already in Medway on, especially on housing issues, Bill Keegan, with him a couple nights ago. So it's wonderful to be with you all again. Oh, and I'm seeing Andrea Downs as well. Andrea and I go way back in the Newton City Council. So it's very nice to be with friends this morning. And I'm going to start off by talking about sort of three big things, and then I want to have a conversation with folks and get people's feedback. The three big things are what's just happened, which is the American Rescue Plan, what's about to happen, which is the American Jobs Plan, and then my priorities, my big three in the face of these, frankly, these seismic events in the 117th Congress with this administration. So let's start with the American Rescue Plan. And things are moving so fast, and we're in such a breathless state of governance right now that we really haven't paused to reflect just how monumental the American Rescue Plan is. American Rescue Plan is a $1.9 trillion both rescue and recovery package that is probably the most significant piece of legislation in the 21st century. It's the most progressive expansion of the social safety net since the Great Society, with increases in the earned income tax credit, the child tax credit, direct $1,400 checks to Americans earning less than $75,000, aid for those who are struggling to afford rent, mortgage, energy, utilities, payments for their homes, direct grants to small businesses. This is one of the cardinal pieces of legislation in the last half century that have directly put money into the pockets of working families. And it's, in that sense, a deeply progressive bill. It is also, and I think this part has been underemphasized relative to the first part, it's also an infrastructure bill. I think that's especially relevant to the audience today. The American Rescue Plan sent $350 billion to states and cities. It sent $130 billion directly for K-12 public education, $30 billion for transit, $8 billion for airports. Now, some of these funds need to be used to cover operating deficits that the last year has shown, and clearly local planners understand that the next year, maybe even the next 2 years, might have some lagging effects from the recession and the operating budget gaps, and the requirement to continue to provide essential services is, of course, sort of the imperative. But there's going to be still money there for capital improvements. And indeed, in the American Rescue Plan, we expressly authorized spending on water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. It's statutorily in there. So while Treasury regulations are still being formulated for how this money can be spent, and yes, there's going to be some strings attached to some of the other uses, really, states and cities have 3 years with this money to spend on water, sewer, and broadband to the degree that they think is appropriate. And I would encourage everyone on this call to be thinking about the funds in that light. And I would also encourage the towns on this call that are part of Norfolk County, which I know are the majority, to be working with the Norfolk County commissioners, because Norfolk County received $100 million plus from the American Rescue Plan. And I know that they are committed to being deliberative, thoughtful, and inclusive in how they are going to be spending that money. And I've talked to the state delegation already, and we'll continue to talk to local officials about making sure we're coordinating with the county so that they're investing that money in a way that's beneficial to constituents. So we're still catching our breath from the American Rescue Plan. And now the president today, as many of you know, is going to be announcing his vision for an American Jobs Plan. The American Jobs Plan is helping to realize his commitment on the campaign trail and Democrats' commitment on the campaign trail to build back better. Now, people are going to have to forgive me for, I'm going to be consulting my notes here because I got this about 20 minutes ago. The administration doesn't like to share information with Congress too far in advance of major speeches that they give, because they know that we're going to be out there yapping about it. But I do want to try to give a sneak peek on what this American Jobs Plan is going to entail, with the caveat that it's going to change. I mean, this is a proposal that the president makes to Congress, but this is going to go through the committees, and we are going to have significant say in exactly how this shapes up. But I do think it's useful to kind of give people a sense of what's about to be proposed. The way I'm thinking about it is looking at sort of taking a view of our society and looking subsurface up vertically. This bill is trying to attack problems at all vertical levels of our infrastructure. So subsurface first, It is making major investments in clean water, in broadband, and in a more reliable and clean electricity grid. And part of the commitment in this bill would be to connect all Americans to high-speed, reliable broadband internet, including the 35% of Americans in rural parts of the country that don't have reliable broadband. So that's the subsurface level. And you kind of move up one, you get to surface transportation level. This will be investing at least $500 billion, and I think more than that, into repairing, although not expanding, our highways, fixing the most economically critical bridges, both the 10 most important bridges for national commerce, as well as thousands of smaller derelict bridges in communities throughout the country, making major investments in transit and making proportionally a much higher investment in transit relative to highways than any previous infrastructure bill ever has. Going one step higher above surface transportation, this bill would look to retrofit about 2 million buildings, both commercial buildings as well as government buildings, to make them more energy efficient and create hundreds of thousands of good jobs in the process of doing that. It would make investments in the care economy, the activity happening inside some of those buildings. Over the last 25 years, as our population has aged, we have seen that there's created almost an unregulated gray market for long-term care and dependent care services that has disproportionately impacted women and minority women, especially in the conditions that they work in, the wages that they receive, and in the benefits and stability that they're provided. This bill would make major investments into the infrastructure and workforce development of the care economy. Two more things here. One, it would invest a significant amount in research and development. We know that one of the cardinal dimensions of competition with China over the next half century is who is investing in the innovations of the future. Biomedical, AI, energy. This bill is going to significantly expand our federal funding for both biomedical and clean energy research. And that is going to disproportionately benefit Massachusetts. When I talk to the major research universities around Massachusetts, one thing they consistently say is, we don't need any special treatment. We just want more money for research because we know that we're going to disproportionately capture that money because we've got some of the most creative and innovative scientists and researchers in the world here. So this is going to be a rising tide that lifts the Massachusetts boat probably even more than any other. And that is certainly going to be a boon to our economy. The final thing that this bill is going to do is invest in our domestic manufacturing resilience and capacity. There are two things I want to call out here in particular, because I think they particularly impact Massachusetts. One is that the president and Congress, understandably, are going to be focused especially on domestic biomanufacturing supply chains, everything from masks and PPE all the way up through cell and gene therapies, the production of biologics like vaccines that require really high-end equipment and personnel training. This is an enormous opportunity for Massachusetts. Massachusetts has the best life sciences R&D in the world, bar none. And increasingly, the biomanufacturing contractors, as well as the entrepreneurs and investors who want to create the next generation of biomanufacturing companies like Resilience or Elevate Bio, they want to be near the R&D. They want to have the tight feedback loop between the process and the research. And investments in domestic manufacturing capacity, I think, are also going to be an opportunity for Massachusetts to capture those investments and to create not just an R&D cluster centered on Boston and Cambridge, but a manufacturing cluster in the life sciences that extends throughout 495 and indeed into the South Coast, into my district. So huge potential there. The other element of this is offshore wind. Probably a little bit less relevant for some of the 495 communities, but certainly relevant for the South Coast of my district, in that the president and Congress and indeed the State House have made major commitments to offshore wind as one of the critical sources of renewable energy. And we are committing not just to prioritize clean energy, but actually to invest in it. And that's going to create, I think, the potential for a cluster of jobs, infrastructure, knowledge training, and of course, the actual turbines in Massachusetts. I think it's going to be centered largely on the South Coast, but that doesn't mean that it can't extend and have its value chain extend up through 495 as well. So those are two big callouts I wanted to make about the manufacturing element in particular that can affect Massachusetts. All right, so American Rescue Plan, a lot of stuff happening, significant sums of money for cities and towns in Massachusetts to be spending, and then boom, we're running right into the American Jobs Plan, which my guess is going to occupy at least the next, excuse me, at least the next 6 months in Congress as we work our way through it. And I know there's tons of political discussion about, is it going to be reconciliation so that it doesn't require the filibuster? Is it going to be paired with other priorities like universal pre-kindergarten? I would encourage folks to sort of make that a little bit of background noise for the next couple of months, because what I just described, that meat of the package, there is broad energy and momentum behind that in Congress. It's going to change a little bit. We got to figure out the parliamentary maneuvers. There's going to be tons of negotiations, but this is a commitment that I'm confident the Democratic caucus wants to run through. And so let's all just keep in mind the end state here that we're driving towards, and not get so distracted day in, day out with breathless commentary on how exactly it's going. Because I just think that's more of a distraction. The policy is what's important. I am confident we're going to pass something finally. What are my priorities in all of this? As a freshman member of Congress entering into such an incredibly intense time, you got to be very disciplined about where you put your time and your political capital to maximize what I can deliver. So I just want to give a preview on 3 things that I'm really focused on. The first is delivering for the district with these bills. This is a ton of activity and frankly, a ton of money. And my job is got to be to deliver for the district, both through the appropriations process, the typical federal budget process, but also through this infrastructure bill. Both the appropriations and the infrastructure bills, for the first time in more than a decade, are going to be allowing what used to be called earmarks, now called member-directed spending. I'm not going to go into all the details about exactly what the earmarks have to look like. Suffice to say, it's incredibly competitive. There's no guarantees about any of these actually getting passed. The Senate can always strip them out. The chairman and the committee staff can push back. But I am certainly going to be trying for as much as I can get for the district, because it's an important function of a member of Congress to work with state and local stakeholders to understand what can have the highest and best use. So I'm encouraging everybody on this call to be coming to our office with ideas for projects, whether it's water, broadband, housing, surface transportation, that impact economic development, impact equity, impact energy and the environment in your area. And I have great deference for state and local officials understanding for what really impacts their communities. The second big priority to me is not losing track of the fact that we are in a pandemic and we still have to win this race between vaccinations and variants. Some of you may have watched the president's press conference last week and seen that not a single member of the press asked him about COVID, which I found to be remarkable. We are in a once-in-a-century natural disaster, and it is still the #1 issue facing most Americans, is the fact that we are in a pandemic that's cost the lives of 500,000 people, and that threatens our economy and has kept kids out of school. So things are going extremely well. We've had multiple 3 million shot days. We're going to reach 5 million shot days. By May, there's going to be enough vaccines for every adult who wants them. By this summer, I think we're going to have a significant reopening of the economy. Kids are going to be back in school, but we can't take our eye off the ball. Continued mask wearing, not having large congregations, not reopening faster than public health guidance would dictate. And then finally, and perhaps most difficult, we've also got to take some responsibility for vaccinating the rest of the world too. One, that's a humanitarian consideration, because there's parts of this world that are not on track to reach herd immunity until well past 2023. That's going to cost hundreds of thousands of lives, continue to keep kids out of school, and really impair economic development for decades to come. But number two, it's in our own self-interest. I mean, right now we're dealing with the Brazil variant. That happened because Brazil is not vaccinating its population, and the reservoir of unvaccinated hosts is creating the environment for mutations and for a variant to emerge that is going to bypass current vaccines. We either solve this globally or we don't solve it. And the United States has an opportunity to take on the mantle of global leadership that frankly we had abdicated over the last 4 years. and do something that is both in the global best interest and also in America's best interest. And by the way, something that's going to be good for Massachusetts, because to create enough vaccines to be shipping them overseas, we're going to have to look at places that have the personnel, the equipment, and the know-how to radically expand vaccine manufacturing. That's Massachusetts. And there are companies here that are ready and willing and able to do it. And then the final point I want to close on before taking people's input and questions is the schools. I started working on the schools issue before I even took office, because to me, as we look back 10 years from now on the effects of the pandemic, and we try to calculate the costs, number one will be the human lives lost, the more than 500,000 Americans. But number two, I worry, is going to be the impacts of a year out of in-person learning for our kids. We need to get kids back into school. The data is in that the schools are safe. We need to continue to be doing pooled coronavirus testing to create transparency and confidence amongst parents and administrators and students and teachers. But the schools are safe. We know that kids' academic and socio-emotional growth requires them to be in person. And we have got to invest ourselves in getting these kids back full time. And then also looking at the learning loss and the suspended learning that happened over the last year, and come up with programs both over the summer and going into next year that can remediate them. And the ARP funds expressly can be used for work with summer camps, for example, and for mental health services to address what's happened. There's almost no other investment that is more meaningful to me personally than ensuring that we do right by our kids after the last year that they've had. I will close there and would welcome people's thoughts.
Well, thank you, Congressman Auchincloss, and for that very cogent summary and update on what you've been doing. It's absolutely clear that you've hit the ground running for us, and I know we all appreciate that. So now we can move on to our question and answer period. If you'd like to raise your hand to ask a question, you can do so. You can also type questions in the Q&A. And Andrea Downs mentioned on how to build back better in transportation, addressing climate change mitigation adaptation, as well as reviving the economy and making it more equitable. So how do we do that? How do we address climate mitigation and adaptation, as well as reviving that economy and trying to strive towards more equity as we build back better, Congressman?
Well, I'm gonna, partly because it's coming from Councillor Downs, I want to emphasize transportation as part of this. And as a note to all of our listeners, Councillor Downs taught me a huge amount about transportation as a fellow city councillor. She's one of the best thinkers, I think, in the Metro West on the issue. I'm on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, and we are, of course, going to be hugely involved in the negotiation of this surface transportation element that I was describing earlier in the American Jobs Plan: the transit, the highways, the bridges, the investments in streets. And one of the things that my staff and I are really pressing on is investing not necessarily in projects that are, quote, shovel ready, but projects that are shovel worthy. And the difference there is that projects that are shovel ready are ones that are pre-permitted, ones that are geared up to go, and that you can do a ribbon cutting in the next 6 months. Projects that are shovel worthy are ones that have empirical support for the fact that they expand access to jobs and services, ideally within a 30-minute commuter shed. And this is not an abstract statement. This is a measurable determination that places like the Department of Transportation in Virginia have been able to make with their Smart Scale program. For a given investment in infrastructure, how much thicker does the labor market get around your average constituent in that area? We know that when you make a labor market thicker, you not only increase median incomes in that area because you give people more access to jobs and services that then have to compete for their labor, but you also make that labor market more resilient to shocks. And in fact, there's good research showing that the distinction between Burlington, Vermont, and Bloomington, Indiana, two labor markets roughly the same size, but very different in the connections that the transportation system has made to jobs and services for the average constituent, one of them much more resilient to shocks than the other. So I want to have the T&I committee take a lens of access to jobs and services for a given project. And when you take that lens, what do you find? You find that expanding highways really does not do a whole lot dollar for dollar. But investing in transit has a huge impact. Investing in better bus service has a huge impact. Even things that seem quotidian, like better bus stops or on-platform boarding, are things that really make people's commutes safer, more reliable, more convenient, and thereby induce more ridership. And then finally, complete streets that have wider sidewalks, that have protected bike lanes, that do a better job of managing curb access between logistics and parking and cyclists. These are things that create much more vibrancy in downtowns and that increase people's options and access. And this is a lens that to a lot of state and local officials might seem maybe a little bit obvious or maybe a little bit behind the curve of the latest urban planning thinking. I can tell you though that the federal government level on the T&I committee, like this is still a robust conversation that we're having. And it's a high point of leverage, because if we can direct funding, we can kind of move this huge fire hose of funding just a little bit towards projects that have a higher impact, that has downstream effects for the next 10, 20 years. One example of that is, can we change the formula from 80-20, meaning 80 cents to highways, 20 cents to transit for federal funds, to 50-50? That would have almost more impact than almost anything else we can do on the T&I committee for funding things that actually connect people to jobs and services.
Thank you, Congressman. And that's I currently serve as and have for a while the chair of the MetroWest RTA, and the bus service there. I know that last mile connection between the major transit infrastructure and getting people to jobs and homes is critical. So I'm glad to hear you're attentive to that and aware of it. We have a question here from Paul, and it's cut off on my, let me see, Paul Yorkis, and he asked two questions. Housing, how do we get more housing production? And what is the best way to let you and your staff know about infrastructure projects in our communities?
Sure. So housing is probably, we've gone town by town these first 3 months and done a lot of roundtables, north and south, Brookline through Fall River, done one-on-one meetings, done one-to-many meetings. I would say that housing is probably the most consistent issue that I hear throughout my district, which is really reflective of the situation that we find ourselves in as a state and as a country, frankly, where we are chronically short millions of units, millions of housing units. The most important thing that we can do, the most important as a country to make housing more affordable, is to build more housing. I've been saying that since before I was a city councilor. I'll say it now. We got to build more housing. That means more liberal zoning laws, and that means streamlining the entitlement process from federal down through local for how people construct housing. We also need to be ensuring that we subsidize housing for people that cannot acquire it without becoming cost burdened. And the chairwoman of financial services, Maxine Waters, and I sit on financial services, has made very clear that she views housing as part and parcel of any infrastructure package. And that's going to be one of the things over the next 6 months that I expect is going to get fleshed out much more broadly. But I would expect to be seeing expanded funding for HUD for both very low income as well as low income subsidies, both on the development and on the demand side. The final thing we got to do, though, and this is an area where me and my staff, I think, are taking trying to take a more of a differentiated role, is we also have to look at innovations within housing production. Over the last 70 years, the cost per key to build housing really has not seen the kind of declines that other industries have seen in their manufacturing processes. It is going to be very hard as a country for us to make housing affordable to live in if we can't make housing affordable to build. The way we build housing is analogous to if you were going to buy a car, you stood in your driveway, called up a general contractor, had them come to your driveway, and had them order 30,000 parts and watch them be assembled in your driveway to create a car. If you did it that way, one, the car wouldn't drive very well. And two, it would probably cost $500,000. This is kind of what we're doing with housing right now. There are companies, though, that are emerging that are trying to productize the development of housing and do it at scale. We need to see nonprofit and government partnerships with companies like these to drive down the cost per key, as has already been happening successfully on the West Coast. I want to try to bring that to the East Coast.
That sounds
and then,
great.
Sorry, the other question was about submissions. So we have put out our submissions form to every state elected official in the district, as well as to local elected officials, to the town managers. If you haven't gotten it, My policy director is on the call right now. She will put her email address in the chat window and you can submit that. You can email her.
And if I could jump in quickly, Joe, for a related question for the congressman, and that would be about timeline. I know obviously sometimes in Congress, things move very slowly. Sometimes with the support of leadership in the administration, they move at the speed of light. Understanding that the specifics might be a little lacking here. Congressman, what is your sense of the timeline? We've got a lot of municipal officials on the call this morning. A lot of our broader audience is municipal officials. For folks who are considering transportation projects or infrastructure projects, they might want to bring to your attention. What is your best sense on the timeline where you'd like to receive that information?
Weeks, not months. Like in the next, week or two. We tried to give people a heads up in the last couple of weeks with this. And Jason, the way you described that is exactly right. It's a 2-year overnight event in the sense that you if things churn for a long time in the committees, it seems like, and you're all these negotiations, and then boom, all of a sudden it's like cooked and it's on the House floor and you're voting on it. So it's definitely good to get ahead of this issue.
And a semi-related question, obviously expanding the audience a little bit from our municipal officials. You had mentioned obviously biomanufacturing supply chains, which is a huge component of our economy all along the 495 MetroWest corridor and in your district as well. What is your sense of some of the supports that might come down that stream? And then related to that, for our companies, our businesses in our region that participate in a biomanufacturing supply chain, what might they be doing at this point? Do you want to hear from them on what their needs are? Should they be reaching out to members of their delegation? How can they best position themselves to be a part of what might be coming along?
I absolutely want to hear from them. And John Weaver, who I think I saw on this call, the head of the Mass Biomedical Initiative in Worcester, he and I have talked a couple of times. I consider him someone who's sort of an advisor to me on this issue. And John, if you're listening, it would almost be helpful if he could help quarterback some of the requests as well, because I would be very keenly interested to get people's input on what might be necessary to catalyze biomanufacturing in the state. I can share what I've been hearing because I've tried to do my homework, talk to a number of companies that are looking to put down roots or have already put down roots here, talk to some investors, and also talk to some consultants who advise biomanufacturing firms. And what I'm hearing is, I'll surface two big things. One is time. When you've got a new piece of IP, a new biomedical innovation, let's call it 15 years that you have on the patent to realize returns on that. First 10 years is R&D and the trials that get that approved. The last 5 years is actually building it and selling it. And so you've got to return things in 5 years before the patent expires. Every 6 months delay that one of these firms faces is 10% of their potential profit. So the biggest consideration they have is, I need to be able to set up shop fast. I can't wait for permitting. I don't want to wait for infrastructure or be concerned about how long it's going to take to hire the appropriate workforce. I want to put down sticks and run. And the second big consideration I've heard is that as Massachusetts is competing, water and sewer infrastructure is a major consideration. That investments that we could make would be in water and sewer, beyond the fact that they're just broadly beneficial and important for public health and economic development, would particularly help us in biomanufacturing.
Thank you, Congressman. Bill Keating, my friend Bill Keating, asked the question from Foxborough. It was asking, he's noted that he's encouraged that there's support at the federal level to help assist with affordable housing. And I think that's been a missing piece, important piece for a while. I know that there are many officials at the local level who would be willing to help you identify ways that the federal government can help in delivering affordable housing at our level. And I'm just going to add this. I'm not a planner myself, but I know many planners. And this is kind of is there any discussion going on related to more and more people obviously working from home, and that there may be in the near term more office space in cities and things like that hypothetically could become housing?
There is. I'm hesitant though for the federal government to take a strong point of view on that. I mean, that's something that's going to be more market driven. If there is demand for housing in areas where there is a surplus of commercial, you're going to see the private sector kind of take on that opportunity. the reason I'm a little hesitant for the federal government to weigh in too heavily on that dynamic is that federal government moves slowly, and these are trends that are moving fast right now. Like, I think this has not shaken out yet, really. I know as I talk to companies, executives, is it 3 days a week? Is it hybrid? Are there employees moving farther out from the core? Are people kind of like, we're seeing housing prices spike throughout all the suburbs and exurbs, but is that going to sustain? I think that we have a lot of learning to do in the next 18 months about a post-COVID economy. And the private sector is going to be able to adapt to some of the new balances between residential and commercial. My focus for federal involvement would be affordable housing in particular, and partnerships between lower cost housing production and nonprofits and government agencies to try to create that scale that we need to really lower the cost per key.
So how would local officials like Mr. Keegan and others reach out to your office to help coordinate their efforts to do local affordable housing?
Yeah, we'll so Jessica will share. Actually, one thing that we might be able to do is if you can get me the list of the people who attended today, we can send out proactively. So it's not like a bunch of one-off emails inbound. We'll send out proactively the form for people's.
Absolutely.
Definitely do that. How about projects? One that I'm certainly aware of, and I think a lot of people are aware of, and as on the Transportation Committee, you may have heard of this. There's a couple bridges that go down to Cape Cod that are coming to the end of their useful life. And I'm sure there's a lot of people that's not in our district or your district per se, but certainly serving the Commonwealth. Getting money to restore, to replace those is a paramount concern, I think, for the region.
And I know that Representative Keating has made that, I mean, maybe his top priority for infrastructure is working with the Army Corps of Engineers and the state to deliver funding for that bridge. I've been keying off of him because he's been working on that issue for a long time now. I think the goal, I think his goal would be to have the Army Corps of Engineers take it over the bridges, make the upgrades, and then return it to the state for state custody. But sort of a back and forth there.
That sounds great. Well, we're open. There's an open forum for questions. So if anybody wants to type one in, or is anybody brave enough to raise their hand in the Zoom function? I know people get.
I think there was a comment in the chat, Joe, as well, from Sarah Raposa.
Okay. Trying to find it here. Okay.
And actually, Sarah's hand is raised, so I'm going to go ahead and
why don't we do that? That's a little bit easier. Trying to chase down question and answers in the Q&A and the chat sometimes.
And Sarah, you're now permitted to talk if you want to unmute yourself.
Great, thank you. Hi, Representative. I just wanted to invite you and your team out to Medfield sometime for an outdoor tour of Medfield State Hospital. It's primarily historic preservation and affordable housing redevelopment plan. And we're getting ready to issue the RFP on April 5th. So I anticipate some need for infrastructure work and hopefully some support.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate the invitation. I think we're actually going to Medfield shortly as well for a visit to a school to see the coronavirus testing in progress.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah, so maybe we can coordinate that. Let me, Jessica, if you could put Joe's, my scheduler's email address in there as well, or just message it to Sarah. We can try to coordinate that.
Thank you.
And I'll add in that the partnership is also happy to facilitate any follow-up activities. If anyone doesn't get contact information out of this morning, you want to get it over the partnership, we'll connect it with the Congressman's staff. I did have a question come into me via direct message, and I'm not sure if it was intended to go into the full audience, so I'll ask it out now. Congressman, what are some of the more significant transportation infrastructure projects in the region that are sort of already on your radar screen for folks who may be considering what they want to use that form to tell you about? What are some of the things that you know are really going to be, maybe your top 2 or 3 that you're going to need to be talking about with your colleagues?
For transportation in particular?
I think transportation in particular, but maybe transportation and infrastructure more broadly.
Yeah. So I have tried to be, I purposely tried to not take a very strong view on this right out of the gate, because I I really, I mean, my title is representative, and that's really a very core part of my job description, is to represent. So we've been canvassing local and state officials to hear what's important to them. And it's going to be more than we can submit, and there's going to have to be a prioritization process, and we're going to be canvassing, kind of doing another round of canvassing of expert opinion as well as state official opinion on this. And I've tried not to kind of go in with a sense that I know the right answer beforehand. I will tell you what has emerged as we've had conversations that are kind of like the big ticket ones, sort of the most high profile. One is South Coast Rail, which I'm sure everybody has heard of and is clearly critically important for the South Coast of my district. That one's actually fully funded by the state, so it's not actually clear that we need any sort of federal support there, but it's something I'm keeping an eye on, and I've made very clear to state officials that if they do see a need, they got to tell me, because the way I'm looking at it right now, it's funded, and they've said it's funded. So if it's otherwise, they need to tell me. The Alston Interchange project in the northern part of my district has huge impact on Newton and Wellesley in particular, I would say. And that one, again, it may not be kind of quite ready for direct federal support, but if there are things that we can do in the appropriations process in report language, basically, which is like directions for federal agencies, think of it, to speed up permitting for the Charles River usage, then that would be something I'd look at. The Franklin line of the commuter rail, the Framingham Worcester line of the commuter rail, frankly, neither of them are very good. I've talked to state officials there again about if they have targeted improvements that they want to make, let's have that conversation. But it needs to sync up with a state level plan. But what I really want to impart to people is not to think that these projects need to be big or kind of glamorous to merit submission. Like, I mean, I was talking about complete streets, like wider sidewalks and bike lanes. I love this stuff. If there are things that are going to make your communities better places to live, to work, to do recreational activities, we want to hear about them.
We appreciate that, Congressman. Talking about you mentioned the Alston project, and I'm not going to put you on the spot to take a direct position on tolls and stuff, but I think as a person from Newton, you're familiar with the toll equity in Massachusetts, and that, you know, places like MetroWest or the bridge coming in from the North Shore do pay tolls and other places don't. That may be as much a local thing, but there is a federal component to that, in that in order to make the state to make different decisions on how they generate revenue for transportation, they require some federal cooperation and some sign off and stuff like that. So I just wondered if that was something that has crossed your plate yet, and you know, if in fact you would be looking towards making those approvals available should those decisions come along.
Yeah, it's a great question, Joe. And in fact, it's not only on my radar screen, it's actually on our kind of agenda. It's a program called the Value Pricing Pilot Program that was in the infrastructure bill last Congress initially, and it was removed as part of the committee process. And the Value Pricing Pilot Program, basically what it does is it affords states the latitude to implement tolling on interstate highways and to experiment with congestion pricing in conjunction with the Secretary of Transportation. There's some sort of back and forth that has to happen there about stakeholder engagement at the local level. It was removed from last term's infrastructure bill, and I want to put it back. And I want to put it back knowing that ultimately it's going to require the state to act. It's not a federal, the best the federal government can do at this point is make it an option for states, but states have to move on it like Oregon has. And I know that congestion pricing, to be blunt, is really unpopular in Massachusetts. I mean, it does not poll well. Let's be realistic here. But it is also, I think, part of the solution. If we are really serious about high occupancy vehicle travel, whether it's bus or fixed rail, as well as micromobility, as well as the kind of complementary transit modalities for transit, things like scooters and e-bikes, if we're serious about making that work, we've got to stop orienting our transportation system around cars and start orienting them around other ways of transportation.
Right. I can say, as chairman of the MetroWest RTA, we have some property out there, and we work well with our partners. If you'd like to look on your schedule and make time to come out and tour our facility, and maybe we would be happy to host some of our colleagues and have a conversation about that last mile and how the RTAs have had to A lot of them aren't collecting fares now. A lot of them have changed their system, and it's the neediest people that use the RTAs. And if you've ever been on them, and I have, and also the fact that last mile, instead of being on direct routes, there's a lot of demand service nowadays.
Yep.
So those things require them to be nimble. So I guess I could reach out to Jessica or somebody and see if we could put that on the schedule sometime going forward.
Well, I'll make a special call out for buses. So Jessica, my policy director, is probably rolling her eyes because she's heard me talk about buses ad nauseum for 3 months. But in terms of like impact per dollar spent, there is almost no transportation modality that has more freight than the bus lines. You put in kind of express bus lanes or even just signal prioritization for buses. You make the bus boarding stations more safe, comfortable, weatherproof, off fare boarding, off platform ticketing and level boarding, increase the reliability in the headways of the routes. This is stuff that like really in the grand scheme of things relative to like fixing bridges is not that expensive. And it helps people. And as you said, Joe, it helps lowest income people disproportionately. So I've got a special place in my heart for buses. And if people have projects for RTAs or improving or connecting RTAs, we certainly want to see those too.
Thank you.
I'd actually like to throw in on that quickly, Joe, if I could. And I want to just thank the Congressman for his focus on buses and the RTAs. This region, despite our 495 MetroWest service area being blessed to be served by 3 different commuter rail lines, we've got Framingham, Worcester in the center, Fitchburg to the north, Franklin in the south, and also some service to Foxborough that was piloted. But we are a region that straddles 5 different RTA service areas. And so buses are a huge component of our focus on transportation. Obviously, in your neck of the woods, in our region, Congressman, we've got portions of MWRTA, but also GATRA as well. I want to thank you, and I know that there were some components of federal stimulus that came before your service, but some has obviously come since. And I want to thank you for the focus that RTAs have received in federal stimulus. I know that it's made a great, a substantial difference to our RTAs who are trying to maintain levels of service in spite of some significant challenges. I know that in Massachusetts, a lot of the bus conversation can sometimes focus on MBTA bus service, rightly so. None of our communities, unfortunately, are served by MBTA buses. We're entirely dependent on what our RTAs are able to do. They're smaller organizations, their staffing and their financial capacities are a lot less. So that federal assistance and that federal focus on RTAs does make a real substantial difference for them. So thank you.
I'm glad to hear that.
It definitely does. And the CARES Act money that came through in the first tranche of, let's say, support, and now the second one, I'm not sure. Clearly, we haven't had a board meeting. We're having one later this month on how that's going to impact us. But that's what's carried a lot of the RTAs and frankly, the MBTA and a lot of transportation as numbers are thankfully coming back now. But that's been a godsend. So thank you for your work on that. I don't want to maximize all the time here from my co-chair. I don't know if Rob, you want to weigh in on any of your concerns?
I don't really have any concerns. I think this is all good stuff as we start to move the Commonwealth forward and the nation, frankly. I did, it's more of a comment than a question, but I did focus in on when you were talking about repair but not expand infrastructure. I think that's important both in the short term as well as the long term. But maintenance of these additional things, I think complete streets, I'm 100% on board with the approach that you're taking there. I think, creating different modes of transportation and options for people to get around is critical in today's day and age. But one of the challenges we face in the Northeast is the ability to sort of maintain those things, mainly because of weather. So long-term sort of planning is critical. Again, more a comment than a question. If you have any thoughts on it, great. But I would think that, looking long-term, it would be helpful if maintenance was also part of the equation as well. So I know agencies struggle with that stuff.
Absolutely. And I know there's a number of elements there. I think maintenance is really tied up with land use in the sense that when you create a highway or you create a big extension of a road that has a bunch of single family zoning around it, the tax base that supports that infrastructure, both surface and subsurface, is pretty paltry. And in fact, it's not sufficient. I mean, it hasn't been sufficient in most American cities and towns in the last 70 years to do it, which is why there's so much liability for the maintenance of it. But when you've got more density and you're making improvements into a relatively smaller area, both surface and subsurface, you've got a bigger tax base to maintain it, which is one of the reasons I've supported as a city councilor and support now more mixed use development in all of our towns.
Yeah, and I'd also, I hear the words of our former Secretary of Transportation, Stephanie Pollock, who's now in Washington. You can't build your way out of congestion anymore. We've kind of done that. I do feel like we have to move into the margins, or what formerly used to be known as the margins on transportation. I think you've got the right approach to doing things. So I'm happy to hear that. Thank you.
Yeah, and I would echo what Rob just said, having retired from the MBTA and understanding that their focus of late has shifted towards maintenance. To be honest, it's much more fun to build something new and cut a ribbon than it is to redo the infrastructure of your signal systems or rebuild track or upgrade your bus fleet to something more environmentally conscious. But they seem to be moving in that direction now. I'd encourage you to keep them on that and nationally, I think that's the same thing. We need to rebuild what we have more than expand.
Fully agree.
Well, that's great. Well, Jason, I think we're getting close to our time. We may have something in the chat, but I'm going to turn it back over to you because I don't see a lot of comments and let you close. I will say, as moderator and one of the co-chairs, thank you very much, Congressman, for joining us. We hope to see you again.
Certainly, and thank you, Joe. And I'm going to ask one last question of the Congressman and offer him to offer any closing thoughts he has, but to maybe tee you up for that. Congressman, what's your level of optimism? We're coming off of a stretch of a few sessions where I think folks were used to maybe not a ton of action from the federal government, especially legislatively, to a flurry of activity during the pandemic. We saw obviously ARPA was a lot larger than maybe some folks thought it might be at the outset. What's your level of optimism for the legislation that you're about to embark on the development of now? And then any other closing thoughts you'd have for us this morning?
Absolutely. One of the things that that Joe said in his introduction is, I love reading American history. And one of the things that you learn in American history is that federal governance is not sort of a linear, every term you kind of churn out a couple of bills sort of thing. Really, it's fits and starts. There is a term of a huge amount happening, Great Society or the 94 term, and then like 5 to 10 years of more or less sclerosis. And that's just kind of been really since the founding, and it's sort of been the cadence of American governance at the federal level. It is very evident to me we are in one of those periods of high productivity right now. And there is a huge amount of consensus in Washington on the Democratic side of the aisle that we really got 2 years guaranteed to govern. Hopefully we have 4, but we definitely have 2. And we got to take advantage of it. So I'm optimistic. I think we're going to pass some legislation. And this is why I said to folks at the beginning, don't worry so much about the day in, day out kind of breathless reporting about this parliamentary maneuver or that negotiating strategy on either side. Like it's going to be a whirlwind. It's going to be crazy. And some of it, frankly, is going to be above my pay grade with the speaker, arm wrestling with Republican leadership. But overall, we have the majority in the House, we have the majority in the Senate, we've got the presidency, we are going to pass legislation, we're going to pass an infrastructure bill. I'm feeling optimistic.
Well, excellent, Congressman. On behalf of the 495 MetroWest Partnership, I want to thank you for your time and for your service in Congress, representing about a quarter of the 495 MetroWest Partnership's service area. We're very pleased to have you speaking on our behalf, and we look forward to having you before us again in the future. I want to thank Rob Nagy and Joe Nolan, our Transportation Committee co-chairs, for their work moderating this morning. I'll emphasize for folks that we will be posting later today a recording of this session. I know some members of the Congressman's staff have published their contact information in the chat. But if those folks would like to follow up directly with the partnership, we're also happy to pass requests for information and feedback along to the Congressman's staff as well. And we will be working to get the Congressman's feedback form out to all of our attendees this morning. So with that, on behalf of the 495 MetroWest Partnership, I want to thank everyone for joining us this morning. Have a great day.
You're welcome.